The fact that Jadab Mukherjee and Madhav Mukherjee were not siblings was something they had forgotten themselves, and so had the outsiders. The poor Jadab had struggled to get his younger brother Madhav through law school and, after much effort, had managed to bring home the only daughter of a wealthy zamindar, Bindu Bashanai, as his sister-in-law. Bindu Bashanai was extraordinarily beautiful. On the day she came to their home with such unmatched beauty and 10,000 rupees in cash, the elder sister-in-law, Annapurna, had tears of joy in her eyes. With no mother-in-law or sister-in-law present in the house, she was the lady of the house. Holding the face of the younger sister-in-law, she proudly declared to the neighbors, "This is how a bride should come home, like a statue of Lakshmi." But within 2 days, this misconception shattered. In just 2 days, she realized that along with the beauty and wealth the younger bride had brought, she had also brought with her 4 times the arrogance and pride. One day, seeing the younger sister-in-law sitting in silence with a gloomy face, Annapurna called her husband aside and said, "Look, my dear, we brought a bride home after seeing the bundle of beauty and money, but this is a snake." Jadab did not believe her words. He scratched his head a couple of times and kept saying, that's right, before heading to the office. Jadab was an exceedingly calm person. He served as a deputy in the Zamindar's office and performed worship at home. Madhav, being 10 to 12 years younger than his elder brother, had recently started his own practice as a lawyer. He came and said, "Sister-in-law, is the money really more than what father had? If you had waited a couple of days, I could have earned money too." Annapurna remained silent. In addition, there was another problem: there was no way to discipline the younger sister-in-law. She had such a terrible condition of seizures that merely looking at her would make everyone in the house dizzy, and without calling the doctor, there was no other option. Thus, the idea that the cherished marriage had been a mistake became firmly rooted in everyone's mind. Only Jadab did not give up. Standing against everyone, he kept insisting, "No, you'll see later. My mother had a beauty like the goddess of the universe, how could that be entirely fruitless? That can't be." One day, after some conversation, seeing the younger sister-in-law sitting with a darkened face, Annapurna felt a jolt of fear. Suddenly, something struck her. She rushed into the room and pulled her 1.5-year-old sleeping son, Amulyacharan, from his bed, throwing him into Bindu's lap before running away. Amuli woke up from his light sleep and began to scream. Bindu, gathering all her strength, restrained herself and ran to the room with the child held close to her chest to protect herself from the grip of fainting. Annapurna watched from the shadows and was thrilled to discover this infallible remedy for the seizures. Since all the burdens of the household rested on Annapurna's shoulders, she couldn't manage to raise her child. Especially, if she couldn't sleep at night after a day full of work, she would fall seriously ill. That's why this responsibility fell to the younger sister-in-law. About a month later, one morning, she entered the kitchen carrying the child and said, "Sister, where's Amulyadhan's milk?" Annapurna, quickly putting her work aside, said fearfully, "Wait a minute, sister, I'm boiling it right now." Bindu had become angry upon entering and sharply retorted, "I told you yesterday that I want milk before 8, it's already 9. If you find this work so heavy, you could just say it plainly, and I'll find another way." "Yes, Brahmin girl, don't you have a bit of sense? The cooking for the entire house could wait just 2 minutes." The Brahmin woman remained silent. Annapurna replied, "If all you care about is putting bangles on the child and applying kajal, then we would have some sense too. Can't you wait just 1 more minute, younger sister?" In response, the younger sister-in-law said, You are absolutely right, sister. If you ever touch Amuli's milk again, I swear, if I ever ask you again, I'll swear that too. Saying this, she plopped Amuli down on the floor and, taking the pot of milk, placed it on the stove. In this unexpected scenario, as Amuli screamed, Bindu pinched his cheek and said, "Shut up, you little rascal, be quiet, or I'll really make you pay." When a maid rushed to take the child in her arms, Bindu shouted at her, "Get away, get away." The maid couldn't step forward, she stood frozen in fear. Without saying anything else, Bindu picked up the screaming child and continued boiling the milk. Annapurna stood still, watching. After a while, as Bindu left with the milk, she addressed the maid, saying, "Did you hear what she said? That day, while laughing, I said, 'You take Amuli.' Today, the younger sister-in-law gave me the same promise." Be that as it may, in this manner, Annapurna's son began to be raised in Bindubashani's lap, and as a result, Amuli learned to call his aunt mother and his mother sister. 4 years later, when the grand ceremony for Amulya's initiation took place, the next morning, Annapurna was busy in the kitchen. Outside, Bindubashani called out, "Sister, Amulya has come to pay his respects, please step outside for a moment." Annapurna stepped out and was astonished by Amulya's adornments. He had eyeliner on his eyes, a bindi on his forehead, a golden necklace around his neck, his hair tied back in a bun, and he wore a yellow spotted cloth. In one hand, he held a clay ink pot tied with a string, and under his arm, he carried a small mat wrapped with a few palm leaves. Bindu said, "Amulya, bow down to your aunt." Amulya bowed to his mother. He was barefoot, without socks, and not wearing any fancy foreign clothes. Seeing this beautiful attire, Annapurna laughed and said, "Look at this, little sister. Is the boy going to school?" Bindu replied with a smile, "Yes, I'm sending him to Gunga Pandit's school. Bless him, sister, that today may be fruitful in his life." Turning to the servant, she said, "Bhairav, tell the Panditji, in my name, to ensure that no one beats the boy. Sister, take this 5 taka, and prepare a nice offering, then send the money with kudum to the school," she said, kissing the boy affectionately and carrying him away. Tears welled up in Annapurna's eyes. She said to Brahman Thakur, "She is so preoccupied with the boy. If she were not pregnant, who knows what she would do?" Pachika said, "Maybe that's why God didn't give her, she's 18 or 19 now." Before she could finish, the younger sister returned alone and said, "Sister, can't we ask Bhat Thakur to set up a school in front of our house? I will bear all the expenses." Annapurna laughed. "She hasn't even walked properly yet, and you're already plotting? All right, why don't you also go and sit at the school?" Bindu, looking flustered, laughed and said, "I'm not plotting, sister. But I think there's a difference between being behind the scenes and being in front of your eyes. Those poor boys are all mischievous, what if they bully him if he is the smallest?" Annapurna said, "And so what if they do? Boys will fight. Besides, all the boys are equally small, and if their parents can send them to school with their heart in their mouth, why can't you?" Bindu absolutely disliked comparing with others. Therefore, she must have felt displeased in her mind and said, "Your words, sister. Suppose someone pokes him in the eye with a pen, what then?" Understanding her thoughts, Annapurna laughed and said, "Then you will take him to the doctor." But honestly, I can't even imagine something like poking eyes after thinking for 7 days and nights. With so many boys in school, who pokes whose eyes? I've never heard of that. Bindu said, just because you haven't heard of it, does that mean such a thing can't happen? Who knows about fate? Well, fine then, just say it once and let's see what happens. Annapurna said solemnly, I can see what will happen. Once you've taken this stance, how will you let it go? But I can't utter such ominous words. And you, say it yourself. Now Bindu got angry and said, I will say it. I won't be able to send my son to school every day from such a distance whether anyone likes it or not, whether he learns anything or not. Yes, Kudum, didn't I tell you to bring some offerings? Noticing her angry demeanor, Annapurna hurriedly said, I'm sending the offerings. How can you be so restless, little sister? By the way, won't the boy grow up? Can you keep him under your shawl forever? Why don't you think about that? Without answering, the younger sister said, Kudum, go and sprinkle some offerings on the Guru Maharaj's feet, then bring the boy back. Also, ask him to come by in the evening. If someone doesn't understand, how can I explain to them? I'm telling you, if someone bullies him when he is the youngest, can you keep him under your shawl forever? Whether I can or not is not a discussion I've come to make. Saying this, she left without waiting for an answer. Annapurna stood astonished. Kudum said, Don't stand there, mother, he may return at any moment. What he has taken, even the deity has no power to undo. That evening, after taking opium, the elder master lay on his bed, inebriated, with the pipe in his mouth, when suddenly the door chain rattled. Yadav struggled to open his eyes and said, Who is it? Annapurna entered the room and said, The younger sister wanted to say something, listen. Yadav sat up hurriedly and asked, Younger mother? What happened? He loved the younger sister dearly. She didn't speak, Annapurna explained, she says that the boys will poke Amulya's eyes with pens, so we should set up a school at home. Yadav dropped the pipe and said, alarmed, Who poked his eyes? Show me, what happened? Annapurna picked up the pipe and laughed, saying, No one has poked his eyes yet, this is all hypothetical. Yadav calmed down and said, Oh, it's just hypothetical. I was worried. Bindu, standing in the background, said softly, Sister, didn't you say you wouldn't bring up such ominous things again? Why did you say it now? Annapurna realized that her manner of speaking was inappropriate and that it wouldn't bear sweet fruit. Understanding the underlying meaning of this subtle remark, she became genuinely frightened. Her anger fell on her innocent husband, and she directed it at him, saying, Opium makes a person blind, can't he also be deaf? Did I say that your eyes were gouged out, Yadav? Yadav, perplexed, said, Why? What happened? Annapurna replied angrily, What happened is fine. It's frustrating to talk to such a person, an act of sin. Saying this, she left the room in anger. Yadav said, What's wrong, mother? Please tell me. Bindu, still hiding behind the door, softly said, If a school is established near the pond. Yadav said, Is that too much to ask, mother? But who will teach? Bindu replied, Panditji has come, if he is paid 10 takas a month, he will set up the school. I suggest we use my interest money for all the expenses. Yadav, pleased, said, That's good, mother. I'll hire someone tomorrow. If Gangaram brings his school here, that's a good thing. Upon receiving her brother-in-law's approval, Bindu's anger subsided. She smiled and went to the kitchen to find Annapurna sitting with a serious expression, while Kudum was explaining something with gestures. Upon seeing Bindu, Annapurna said with a pale face, "Oh, look at this." Bindu realized they were talking about her and approached, asking, "What happened?" Kudum, frightened, stuttered, "No, sister, it's nothing," Badma said. Bindu replied sternly, "You've got my attention, now go do your work." Without further argument, Kudum left quickly. Then Bindu said to Annapurna, "The advice from the elder sister is quite good. We should suggest to Bhattakur to increase their pay." If Bindu was pleased, she called Annapurna sister, but if she was angry, she called her elder sister. Annapurna said in a furious tone, "Don't say anything more, I'll be in big trouble with Bhattakur. And Bhattakur is the same. He'll start immediately. What are you saying, mother? What are you saying, mother? I've seen plenty of fate, little sister, but I've never seen one like yours. What a fate you were born into." Everyone at home seems frozen in fear. Bindu's anger had indeed subsided, and she laughed at Annapurna's tone. "Why, you shouldn't be afraid." Annapurna replied, "Why shouldn't I be? Anyone who sees your warrior form would turn pale. But being so angry isn't good for the younger sister. Don't you have the younger one yet? If you had a son, you would have been a mother of 4 or 5 by now. And who can I blame? That old fool must have coddled your head." Bindu replied, "The fate I was born with, sister, I accept. Wealth, fortune, and affection are common to many, that's not the point, but to have a brother-in-law like a god requires many births of penance. My destiny, sister, what can you do in jealousy? But he hasn't cradled my head with affection. If anyone cradles my head with affection, it's you." Annapurna waved her hand and said, "Me? There's no one to say such a thing. My discipline is very strict, but what can I do? I would be killed if I didn't care. Oh God, is there any sin to breathe freely?" Bindu's heart melted. She took a few steps closer, placed her head on Annapurna's lap, and wept. "Mother, I won't be able to get out of my father's house unless I send my son to school." A few moments passed in silence. Then Annapurna, softening, said, "All right, I won't even ask again. Send him to school, then let's see who bullies him." Just as one mother raises her 2 sons, these 2 mothers spent another 6 years caring for a single child each. Amulya has now grown up and is in the 2nd grade of entrance school. A tutor is engaged at home, who teaches in the morning, after which Amulya had gone outside to play. Today is Sunday, and there is no school. Annapurna entered the room and asked, "What should I do, younger sister?" Bindu, rummaging through the closet on the floor of her room to select clothes for Amulya, replied without looking up, "What is it, sister?" She seemed somewhat displeased. Annapurna, surprised by the array of clothes, didn't notice the expression on her face and, after a moment of silence, asked, "Are all these Amulya's clothes?" Bindu replied, "Yes." Annapurna said, "How much money do you waste? With the price of one of these, a poor boy could have clothes for an entire year." Bindu felt irritated but calmly replied, "That may be so. However, there is always a difference between the poor and the rich. What's the use of being sad about it, sister?" Annapurna replied, "That may be true for the rich, but you have a tendency to go overboard in everything you do." Bindu raised her head and said, "Just tell me what you came here to say, sister, I don't have time right now." "Do you ever have time, younger sister?" she said, leaving in anger. Barab had gone to call Amulya and returned after about an hour of searching. Bindu asked, "Where have you been all this time?" Amulya remained silent. Barab said, he was playing kites with the farmers' boys across the river. Bindu was very afraid of this game and had forbidden it, saying, "Didn't I tell you not to play kites?" Amulya turned pale with fear and said, "I was just standing there, they forced me." "Forced you? All right, go now and then we'll see," she said as she started to dress him. A month or two ago, Amulya had undergone the rite of passage, and he strongly objected to wearing a ceremonial cap on his shaven head. But Bindu was not one to let go easily, she insisted and made him wear it. Amulya stood there crying with the cap on his bare head. As Madhav entered the room, he remarked, "How long will it take him?" Upon noticing Amulya, he laughed and said, "Wow, look who's turned into the king of Mathura." Amulya, embarrassed, threw off the cap and fell face down on the bed. Bindu got angry. "He's just a child crying, and you?" Madhav became serious and said, "Don't cry, Amulya. Get up, people will say I'm the mad one, and they'll blame you too." This same thing had happened once before, and Bindu had been very angry about it. Hearing Madhav repeat those words, she flared up and said, "I do everything like a mad person, don't I?" She got up and, taking Amulya by the arm, began to hit him with a fan's handle, pulling off his expensive velvet clothes one by one. Madhav, scared, went outside to inform Annapurna, saying, "The sister-in-law has gone mad, you should go take a look." Annapurna entered the room and saw Bindu stripping Amulya of all his clothes and making him wear a simple garment, while Amulya stood there, pale with fear. Annapurna said, "Well done, younger sister, why did you take it off?" Bindu, releasing Amulya, suddenly clasped her hands together and pleaded, "I beg you, great lady, please leave us alone for a moment. With all five of you mediating, the boy's life will be ruined." Annapurna stood there, speechless. Bindu grabbed one of Amulya's ears, pulling him to one corner of the room, and said, "Just as you are a naughty boy, you should be punished. You must stay locked up in the house all day. Sister, please come outside. I will close the door." Saying this, she stepped out and secured the door with a lock. It was around 1 o'clock when Annapurna could no longer bear it and said, "Yes, younger sister, will you really not let Amulya eat? Will the whole household fast for him?" Bindu replied, "That's up to everyone in the house." Annapurna said, "What kind of talk is this, younger sister? If that one boy in the house is starving, what do you think will happen to the servants?" Bindu stubbornly replied, "I don't know that." Annapurna realized that arguing wouldn't help and said, "I'm saying this, keep your elder sister's words. Forgive him today. Besides, if he gets sick from fasting, you'll be the one to suffer." Looking at the time, Bindu softened and called Kudum, saying, "Go bring him something to eat." But she added, "Sister, I warn you, in the future, don't talk back to me." This was where the chaos ended for that day. After Yadav took the charge of the younger brother, he had left his job to look after their own affairs. Due to the younger sister-in-law, the 10,000 rupees he had in hand were doubled through interest. With a portion of that money and relying on Madhav's earnings, he had constructed a large house about 10 miles away over the past year. It had just been completed about 10 days ago. The plan was to move in after the Durga Puja festivities, so one day, while sitting at the table, Yadav addressed the younger sister-in-law, saying, "Your house is ready now, mother, go take a look and see if anything is left unfinished." Bindu had a habit of staying hidden behind the door during mealtime, letting her brother-in-law eat first. She revered him like a deity, everyone did. She said, "Nothing is left." Yadav laughed and said, "You're judging without even seeing it, mother." "All right, fair enough. But there's one more thing. I would like all our relatives, wherever they are, to come together for a good day, and then we can worship the house deity. What do you say, mother?" Bindu slowly replied, "I'll tell my sister, whatever she says will go." Yadav said, "Tell her. But you are the wealth of my household, mother. Everything will happen according to your wish." Annapurna, sitting nearby, smiled and said, "Still, it would be nice if your mother, the goddess of prosperity, were a little more tranquil." Yadav replied, "What do you mean, elder sister-in-law? My mother is my goddess. She grants me wishes and, if needed, will wield a sword. That's what I want. Since she has come, I have faced no sorrow." Annapurna said, "That's true, I still get scared just thinking about the days before she came." Feeling embarrassed, Bindu brushed the matter aside and said, "You can bring everyone. Our house is quite big, no one will have any trouble. If they wish, they can even stay for 2 to 6 months." Yadav said, "That will be the case, mother. I will arrange for everyone to come tomorrow." Their cousin Ilaksha's condition was not good. Yadav would often send her financial assistance. For some time, she had been writing letters expressing her desire to keep her son Noran here for his studies, and now she had come with her son from Uttarpara. No one could say for sure what her husband Priyanath was doing there, but within a couple of days, he also arrived. Noran was around 16 or 17. He wore wide pant clothes and combed his hair 8 to 10 times a day. The sight of him was indeed something to behold. This evening, everyone was gathered on the kitchen balcony, and Ilaksh was sharing her son's remarkable qualities and appearance. Bindu asked, "Noran, which class are you in?" Noran replied, "4th class. Royal reader, grammar, geography, arithmetic, and so much more. Decimal you won't understand, and..." Ilaksh proudly glanced at her son and said to Bindu, "Isn't it just a book or two, little sister? A mountain of books. Tomorrow, take them out of the box and let your aunts have a look." Noran nodded, "Okay, I'll show you." Bindu said, "It's still a long way to pass." Ilaksh replied, "What's the delay, little sister? By now, he should have passed not just 1 but 4. It's just because of that good-for-nothing master. May he be doomed, he doesn't even realize how enviously he looks at my son. Is he allowing him to pass? No. Out of jealousy, he's been stuck in the same class for years." Bindu was astonished and said, "No, it can't be like that." Ilaksh insisted, "It happens, it really does. The masters all conspire together to demand bribes. I'm a poor person, where will I get the money for bribes?" Bindu fell silent. Annapurna, feeling genuinely saddened, said, "Is it right to harass someone like this? That's not good work. But here, we don't have such things. Our Amulya brings home good prizes every year, but we never have to pay bribes." At that moment, Amulya quietly came in and sat on his little aunt's lap. He leaned in and whispered, "Tomorrow is Sunday, little aunt, don't tell the master to come today." Bindu laughed and said, "Look at this boy, Thakurji, once he gets a story, he won't get up. Amulya, tell the master not to come today, you're not studying anymore." Noran, surprised, said, "Hey Amulya, you're such a big boy, and you still sit on a girl's lap." Bindu laughed, "Is that all? Still, at night." Amulya anxiously pressed his hand over her mouth and said, "Don't say that, little aunt, don't say that. Bindu did not say anything, but Annapurna revealed, he still sleeps by little Ant at night. Bindu added, not just sleep, sister, he clings to her all night like a bat. Amulya, embarrassed, buried his face in his little Ant's chest. Noran said, oh come on. Do you study English? Annapurna responded, of course he does. He studies English in school. Noran said, wow, studying English. Let me see you spell engine then. I bet you can't. Ilaksh commented, those are tough words, can a child like him spell those? Annapurna asked, can't Amulya spell? But Amulya didn't lift his head at all. Bindu gently pressed his head to her chest and said, if you all keep embarrassing him, how will he spell anything? Then looking at Ilaksh, she said, he'll pass this year, I'm sure. Our master has said he will get 20 taka. With that money, he will buy a pair of horses like his uncle. Even though the statement was true, everyone laughed in jest. Ilaksh pointed to Bindu and said, my Narendranath is not just good at studying, he acts so well in theatre that people can't help but cry. What a performance he gave as Sita, can you share it with the ants once? Noran immediately knelt down, joined his hands, and began to sing in a high-pitched voice, oh, Praneshvar. What a terrible moment for your maid. Bindu, feeling anxious, stood up and said, stop, stop, be quiet. The Lord is above. Noran, startled, fell silent. Annapurna was so enchanted by that much that she said, whether it's about the Lord or the deities, that's a good thing, little sister. Bindu, annoyed, said, well, you go ahead and talk about the Lord and deities, we're leaving. Noran said, all right then, I'll perform Savitri's part. Bindu said, no. Hearing this, Annapurna realized that the matter had gone too far and wouldn't end here. Ilaksh, being new, didn't understand the inside story and said, all right, let's leave it for now. The men can come back one day during lunchtime. Ah, how much has he learned in music and dance? Sing that song of the Mayanthi once for your aunts, and they won't want to stop listening. Noran asked, should I sing it now? Bindu was burning with anger but didn't say anything. Annapurna quickly said, no, no, now isn't the time for songs. Noran said, okay, I'll teach the song to Amulya. I know how to play too. The drum is quite tough, and, give me that brass pot to show you. Bindu gestured to Amulya to get up and said, go, Amulya, go study at home. Amulya, enchanted by the conversation, didn't want to get up and quietly said, just a little longer, little ant. Bindu didn't say anything and pulled him up, taking him along to the house. Suddenly, Amulya wondered why he behaved that way, and fearing that Amulya might get spoiled in the company, she clearly understood that Noran wouldn't prefer to stay here for studying. She said, Noran, don't perform those actings in front of your little aunt. She's a strict person, she doesn't like those things. Ilaksh, surprised, asked, does little sister not like those things? That's why she got up so abruptly. Annapurna said, it might be so. One more thing, son, you will study for your own good so that you can relieve your mother's suffering, make sure not to spend too much time with Amulya. He's just a child, much younger than you. Ilaksh didn't like this remark. She said, that's true, he's a poor boy, and he should live like a poor person. But if I say, big sister, Amulya is your little child, and my Noran is an old man? 1 or 2 years difference doesn't matter. And he has never seen the son of a rich man, he's seeing it here for the first time. How many sons of kings and princes are there in their theatre troupe? Annapurna, feeling out of her depth, said, "No, Thakurji, I didn't mean that, I meant to say." "How can you say that, big sister? Are we so foolish that we wouldn't understand even this? But didn't brother say that Noran would study here, that's why he came, otherwise, wouldn't we have our own affairs?" Annapurna, feeling ashamed, said, "God knows, Thakurji, I didn't say that, I meant that he should relieve his mother's pain." Ilaksh replied, "All right then, yes. Noran, you go outside and sit, don't mingle with the sons of the rich." Saying this, she nudged her son away and went herself. Annapurna, like a storm, rushed into Bindu's room, crying out, "Oh dear! Do we have to abandon the family just for you? Tell me how you came back." Bindu replied very simply, "Why should we abandon them, sister? You can enjoy life with the relatives, I'll just run away with my son." "Where will you run away to, I wonder?" Bindu said, "I'll tell you my address on the day of leaving, don't worry." Annapurna said, "I know that. You won't allow me to show my face to 5 people, will you? All this time, this sister has burned my flesh and bones to ashes." Saying this, she was leaving when she saw Madhub entering and flared up again, saying, "No, Thakurpo, if you all go away somewhere, then let that sister go, I can't keep her any more, I'm saying this plainly today." Madhub, astonished, asked his wife, "What's going on?" Bindu replied, "I don't know, the big sister is saying to let her go." Madhub said nothing further. He picked up the newspaper from the table and went outside. Thakurji appeared to be foolishly watching, but that was a mistake. When she saw that the childless young bride had a lot of money, she immediately turned her attention in that direction and began to scold her husband, Priyanath, every night, saying, "Everything I had is gone because of you. If I had stayed here without falling for your empty words, today I would have been the queen of the king. What is this, to abandon such a golden opportunity and have that black ghost of a boy?" She would end with a long sigh, expelling all her frustrations as she concluded, "God exists for the poor." Priyanath would fall asleep while silently regretting his own foolishness. Thus, this couple passed their days, with Thakurji's affection for the young bride swelling like a flood. "Today, in the afternoon," she said, "that hair of the young bride is like a cloud, but I have never seen it tied up. The landlord's daughters will visit today, come, let me tie your hair up." Bindu replied, "No, Thakurji, I can't put anything on my head. The boy has grown, he will see." Thakurji, surprised, said, "What are you saying, young bride? Just because the boy is grown doesn't mean a wife shouldn't tie her hair? My Narendranath is even more grown than the enemy's son, so will I stop tying my hair?" Bindu said, "Why would you stop, Thakurji? Narend has always seen it, that's different. But if Amulya suddenly sees my hair tied up, he'll stare at it. He might shout, or who knows, oh, that would be very embarrassing." Annapurna suddenly walked in from that direction, looked at Bindu, and abruptly stopped, saying, "Why are your eyes glistening, young bride? Come, let me see." Bindu, feeling embarrassed in front of Ilakshi, replied, "Why would I show you every day? Am I a little girl that I won't notice if I fall sick?" Annapurna said, "No, you're old. Come closer, it's the month of Bhadra and Ashvin, the days are very bad." Bindu replied, "I'm not coming. I'm telling you, I'm fine, but still, come closer." Annapurna said, just make sure you're not faking. And, while giving a doubtful glance, continued on her way. Ilakshi remarked, "Does it seem like the big bride has a bit of a fever, or what?" Bindu paused for a moment and replied, "It seems like everyone has that kind of fever, Thakurji." Ilakshi remained silent. Annapurna picked something up in her hand and was returning along the same path when Bindu called out, "Sister, listen, will you tie up my hair?" Annapurna turned back. After a moment of silence, understanding the whole situation, she said to Ilakshi, "I have told you many times, Thakurji, it's pointless to tell her. She won't tie her hair with so much hair, won't wear so much fabric and jewelry, won't even glance at her beauty once. She has all these foolish ideas. The boy is the same. The other day, Amulya said to me, 'What good is wearing clothes? Little Ma also has plenty, what's the point?'" Bindu, proudly raising her head, smiled and said, "But see, sister, if I want to raise my son to be one among many, is this kind of foolishness required from the mother? If I live till then, sister, you'll see, the people of the country will point and say, 'That's Amulya's mother.'" Saying this, her eyes filled with tears. Annapurna, seeing this, lovingly said, "That's why we never say anything about your son. May God fulfill your heart's desire, but we have no hopes that the boy will grow up to be one among many." Wiping her eyes with her sari, Bindu said, "But I'm living with that one hope, sister. Oh dear." Suddenly, every part of my body became prickly. If that hope ever gets crushed, I'll go mad. Annapurna remained silent. She was not unaware of the young bride's feelings, but she had never realized how intense her hope and longing were. Today, she became aware of why Bindu was so alert and cautious about Amulya. Looking at the face of this all-wishing mother, her own maternal heart filled with indescribable reverence. She turned her face away to hide her tears. Thakurji said, "So be it, young bride, today." Bindu quickly interrupted, "Yes, Thakurji, please tie up Didi's hair. I've never seen her hair tied up since entering this house." With that, she pressed her lips together and smiled as she moved away. About 5 or 6 days later, one morning, the old barber Yadav was coming down after cutting hair. Amulya stopped him, saying, "Kailashda, can you cut hair like Naren does?" The barber, astonished, replied, "How can I do that, Dada Babu?" Amulya pointed to different parts of his own head and said, "Look, here it's 12 annas, here it's 6 annas, here it's 2 annas, and right here by the neck, very short. Can you cut it?" The barber laughed and said, "No, Dada, not even if my father comes." Amulya didn't give up. With encouragement, he said, "It's not difficult, Kailashda, here it's 12 annas, here it's 6 annas." The barber, seeking an escape, said, "But today, what will I do? I can't cut it without your little mother's order." Amulya replied, "Okay, wait, I'll go ask." Saying that, he went a step away, then returned and said, "All right, give me your umbrella, otherwise, you'll run away." He forcefully took the umbrella and ran into the house. "Little Ma, hurry, come here." Little Ma had just finished her bath and was sitting down to eat, and hurriedly said, "Oh, don't bother me, don't bother me, I'm preparing my lunch." "Finish your lunch later, Little Ma, just come out and give the order, or he won't cut it, he's standing there." Bindu was a bit surprised. It usually took a lot of effort to get her hair cut, why was he so eager today to cut it? Unable to understand, she went outside, and the barber said, "It's a big order, Ma, like Narend Baba 12 annas, 6 annas, 3 annas, 2 annas, 1 anna, it has to be cut like that. How can I do that? Amulya said, you can do it? Okay, wait, I'll call Narendra, saying that he ran away. He dashed off, but Narend was not at home. After some searching, he returned, saying, he's not here. Well, it's all right, little Ma, just stay here and show me properly, show me this is where it's 12 annas, here it's 6 annas, here it's 2 annas, and here it's very short. Seeing his eagerness, Bindu smiled and said, I'm going to prepare my lunch. Prepare your lunch later, or I'll cut it. Bindu had no choice but to stand there. The barber began cutting hair. Bindu blinked her eyes. He cut all the hair evenly. Amulya, running his hands over his head, said happily, this is just right. With that, he jumped up and ran away. The barber, with the umbrella under his arm, said, but Ma, tomorrow it will be hard for me to enter this house. The priest was calling for food. Bindu was sitting in one corner of the kitchen, arranging milk in a bowl, when she heard Amulya was searching for a comb to comb her uncle's hair throughout the house. A little while later, he came crying and fell onto Bindu's back. Nothing has happened, little Ma. He messed everything up. Tomorrow I'll kill him. Bindu couldn't hold back her laughter. Amulya, pulling himself away, cried angrily, are you blind? Can't you see? Annapurna, hearing the crying, entered the room, listened to everything, and said, what else? Tomorrow I'll tell him to cut it properly. Amulya, growing angrier, said, how will it be 12 annas tomorrow? Where is the hair here? Annapurna, trying to soothe him, said, it may not be 12 annas, it can be 8 or 10 annas. That's nonsense. 8 or 10 annas. Is that fashionable? Ask Narendra, I want 12 annas. That day, Amulya didn't eat well, he threw down his plate and walked away. Annapurna said, when did your son get the desire to grow his hair long? Bindu smiled, but a moment later, she became serious and let out a sigh, saying, sister, it's a trivial matter, and that's why I'm laughing, but I'm terrified everything starts like this. Annapurna couldn't say anything more. Durga Puja arrived. The landlords in their neighborhood were busy preparing to welcome the goddess. Every day, there was a flurry of activities, but the little maid in Bindu's house was busy with the household chores. She wanted to clean the house every day, but every day the boy created a mess. He seemed to be an enemy. One day, Bindu saw Amulya come running in with mud on his clothes. She scolded him, you have dirtied your clothes. Why didn't you pay attention? Amulya cried out, but I didn't want to get dirty. I just went out to play. Then take care of your clothes. She shouted, taking off his shirt. She was about to wipe his face when he suddenly ran out. Bindu felt tired from the constant battle, but she couldn't stop thinking about how her son was becoming a nuisance, but a son should also be someone to nurture. Finally, on the day of Durga Puja, the goddess arrived in the village, and all the families began their celebrations. The streets were filled with joy, but Bindu couldn't participate. She was worried that Amulya would create a scene like he did before. This day was a festival, but Bindu just stood at home, looking from her window and wondering if her son would be okay. Amulya, meanwhile, was creating a mess everywhere in the village, dancing and playing joyfully, and gradually, he started gathering friends who were all laughing and playing around him. Seeing this, Bindu couldn't help but smile. At that moment, she realized that even if things were a bit chaotic, Amulya's joy was more important than the worries she had. The innocence of childhood was a beautiful thing, and Bindu knew that even in all the chaos, there was joy and love in their lives. About 10 days after returning from Bindu's parental home, one afternoon, Annapurna entered her room and said, "Younger sister." The younger sister sat frozen in front of a heap of dirty clothes. Annapurna asked, "Has the laundryman come?" The younger sister did not respond. Annapurna, noticing the expression on her face, felt frightened. Anxiously, she asked, "What happened?" Bindu pointed with her finger at two small pieces of burnt cigarette butts and said, "These came out of Amulya's shirt pocket." Annapurna stood speechless. Suddenly, Bindu burst into tears and said, "I fall at your feet, sister, send them away or at least send us somewhere else." Annapurna could not respond. After standing in silence for a while, she left. In the afternoon, Amulya returned from school, had his meal, and went out to play. Bindu did not say a word. Barab, the servant, came to complain that Narayan Babu had slapped him without reason. Bindu, irritated, said, "Tell my sister." Madhav returned from court, and while undressing, tried to make some trivial joke but was scolded into silence. In the unseen background, a great storm was brewing, but only Annapurna could sense it within the house. Restlessly, she fidgeted throughout the evening, and finally, finding the opportunity to be alone, she took the younger sister's hand and, in a pleading voice, said, "After all, he is your son, forgive him this time. Instead, scold him in private." Bindu replied, "He is not my son, I know that, and you know it too. What is the need to exaggerate for no reason, sister?" Annapurna insisted, "It's not me, you are his mother, I gave him to you. When he was small, I fed and clothed him. Now that he has grown, you all take him, let me be, Bindu," she said and walked away. That night, Amulya came to sleep next to Annapurna, with a tearful face. Understanding the situation, Annapurna irritably said, "Why are you here? Go away, do as I say." Amulya glanced back, saw his father sleeping, and quietly left without saying a word. The next morning, Kudum came to fetch dirty dishes from the kitchen and saw Amulya asleep on a pile of wooden blocks in one corner of the veranda. She rushed to fetch Bindu. Annapurna had also woken up and came outside to stand close. Bindu sharply said, "Did the elder sister drive him out last night? It disturbs sleep, doesn't it?" Seeing her son's condition, tears welled up in her eyes from both grief and anger, but inflamed by Bindu's cruel reproach, she retorted, "You can save yourself by shifting your own faults onto others." Bindu picked up the boy and noticed he was warm, he had a fever. Of course, he will catch a cold in the chilly weather of Kartik. If he gets well now, we'll survive. Annapurna anxiously leaned down and said, "He has a fever, let me see." Bindu forcefully pushed her hand away and said, "No, there's nothing to see." Then, comfortably lifting the sleeping boy into her arms, she shot a venomous glance at Annapurna and walked to her own room. In 5 or 6 days, Amulya recovered, but Bindu did not forgive the elder sister's offense. Since that day, she did not even speak properly. Annapurna understood everything in her heart, yet she remained silent. She could not forget the injustice of Bindu laying all the blame before everyone. One day, after some remark, she let it slip to Alakshi, his fever was due to the younger sister. That he did not die is his luck. Alakshi wasted no time in bringing this to Bindu's notice. Bindu listened attentively, but did not speak. Only she and Alakshi knew that she had heard it. Bindu completely cut off communication with the elder sister. For a few days, items were being moved to a new house, they had to leave the next morning. Yadav was in the house with the boys, and Madhav was elsewhere for a lawsuit, he was also absent. In the meantime, a serious incident occurred in the house. In the evening, a teacher had come to teach, and for some reason, Bindu called him over and sent him. As the teacher was about to leave with a nod of acknowledgement, Bindu asked, "How is your student doing in his studies these days?" The teacher replied, "He has always been good in his studies, he always comes first." Bindu said, "That's true. But these days, he has learned to smoke cigars." The teacher, astonished, said, "He has learned to smoke cigars." After a moment, he said, "It's not surprising, boys learn everything by watching." "Who did he learn it from?" The teacher remained silent. Bindu said, "You should inform his father about this." The teacher shook his head and said, "You see, just 5 or 7 days ago, he entered a gardener's garden on the way to school, picked unripe mangoes, broke a tree, and caused a ruckus." With a gasp, Bindu asked, "And then?" The gardener reported it to the headmaster, who fined him 10 rupees and calmed him down. Bindu could not believe it. Was it my Amulya? Where would he get that money? The teacher said, "I don't know, but he was indeed there." Narayan Baba from this house was also there, along with 3 or 4 other naughty boys from school. I heard this from the headmaster. Bindu asked, "So the money has been collected?" "Yes, I heard so," the teacher replied. "All right, you go now." Saying this, Bindu stayed right there. From her lips, only a faint murmur escaped, "Without informing me, who dared to give money in this house?" She was already feeling low, having stopped speaking to her sister, and this news left her completely out of sorts. She got up and went into the kitchen. Annapurna was grinding vegetables for dinner and raised her head to look at the younger sister's overcast face. Bindu said, "Sister, did you give Amulya money?" Annapurna was already fearful of this suspicion, her throat felt dry. She softly asked, "Who told you?" Bindu replied, "That's not important, what matters is why you didn't tell me, and why didn't you tell me the reason for this?" Annapurna remained silent. Bindu said, "You don't want me to discipline him, that's why you hid it from me. Amulya will not lie to elders no matter what. Did you knowingly give him money, or not?" Annapurna slowly said, "It's true, but this time forgive him, sister, I am asking for forgiveness." Bindu's heart was burning, she said, "Just once. From now on, I will forgive him for eternity. I will not speak again. I cannot bear to see him slowly ruining himself like this, better for him to go completely." "But how dare you?" The last statement pierced Annapurna sharply. Still, she remained silent. But as Bindu kept berating her, her anger continued to escalate. She shouted again, "In everything, you play the innocent, this time forgive him, but the fault is more yours than his. I will not forgive you." The servants and workers were also standing by, listening in the shadows. Annapurna could no longer endure it, she said, "What will you do, hang me?" As the flame was ignited, Bindu, blazing like gunpowder, replied, "That would be your deserved punishment. Is it a crime to give a couple of coins to my own son?" In the confusion, Bindu forgot the real issue and sat down, saying, "Then why would you give it? Where would you get money to waste?" Annapurna replied, "You waste money, don't you?" "I do so with my own money, who do you waste money with, I wonder?" Annapurna now rose, furious. She was the daughter of a destitute household. She felt that Bindu had made that implication. Standing up, she said, "You may be the daughter of a wealthy man, but that doesn't mean no one else can give even 2 coins, don't be arrogant." Bindu said, "I don't boast, but do consider, when you give a penny, whose money do you use?" Anpurna shouted, "Whose money do I give? Just say whatever comes to your mouth. Go away from here." Bindu said, "Go away, I will be here tomorrow morning, but can't you see whose money you're spending? Don't you know whose earnings you're eating and using?" Suddenly, having said that, Bindu fell silent. Anpurna's face had gone pale. For a moment, she looked at the younger sister with unblinking eyes and said, "You eat from your husband's earnings. I am your servant, and he is your worker. Isn't that what's in your heart? Then why haven't you said that until now?" Her lips trembled again and again. She clenched her teeth and, pausing for a moment, said, "Where were you, younger sister, when you bought those nice clothes for your son?" Bindu whispered, "I don't care for them. No matter how I suffer, Amulya is my son. Why do I care for them?" Amulya had now started running, and he was laughing with the boys. At this, Bindu's heart was seized with deep grief. Seeing that, Anpurna stood up, looking for an opportunity. "Why do you care about those beautiful clothes? And when you had no clothes, who did you care for?" Seeing Anpurna grow furious, Bindu stood frozen with astonishment. Amulya stood on the other side with his clothes torn. "How did you get such fine clothes?" asked the teacher, who had come to see the play. Anpurna replied, "I made them." The teacher nodded, "You are a true gentleman, the one who sees things." Saying this, he turned to Bindu and said, "Why do you care?" Everyone had arrived at the new house except for Yadav, Annapurna, and Amulya. From outside came Bindu's aunt, her aunt's daughter, grandchildren, and from her parental home, her father and mother, along with their servants, completely filling the house. On the day of arrival, Bindu had seemed a bit disoriented, but by the next day, that feeling had passed. There was no doubt in her mind that Annapurna would come as soon as she was angry. Bindu became busy with the preparations for the worship, arranging for people to be fed. Bindu's father asked, "Where is your son? I don't see him." Bindu replied briefly, "He is at that house." Her mother questioned, "Couldn't your sister come?" Bindu said, "No." Her mother then remarked, "If everyone is here, who will stay at that house? Even if the ancestral home is closed, it can't be kept empty." Bindu silently got back to work. For the past few days, Yadav would come out once every evening, talk a bit, gather news, and then return inside, but he didn't enter the house. The night before the house worship, he came inside to call Alakshi and was seeking guidance. Upon learning this, Bindu stood hidden and listened. She remembered how lovingly her brother-in-law had treated her since childhood, how many affectionate calls she had heard. Yadav would call her mother but had never referred to her as sister-in-law. She recalled how she had complained to him about conflicts with her sister. None of those complaints had ever been ignored, but today, standing before him, she felt immense shame, rendering her speechless. Yadav left. She silently went inside the room, covering her face with her shawl, and began to cry quietly. People were around, and she feared someone might hear. The next morning, Bindu called her husband and said, "It's getting late, the priest is seated, and the Lord has not yet arrived." Madhav, surprised, asked, "Why not?" Bindu, equally surprised, replied, "Why not? Who will do all this without him?" Madhav said, either I or my brother-in-law Priyababu will do it. Brother can't come. Angrily, Bindu retorted, just saying he can't come? Is there anyone else with the right to do it? No, no, that won't do. I won't let anyone else do anything without him. Madhav said, then stay shut. He isn't home, he has gone to work. Such schemes of the elder mistress. Then I see he won't come, Bindu said, tearing up and walking away. For her, the worship, the festival arrangements, and the meals, all of it became meaningless in an instant. For 3 days, she had been thinking about how today the Lord would come, her sister would come, Amulya would come. No one else knew how much she had relied on these thoughts for peace. As soon as her husband spoke a word, everything vanished like a mirage, and the weight of the festival's grand preparations pressed down on her heart like stone. Ilakshi came and said, "Give me the key to the pantry, little bride, the maid has brought sweets." Bindu tiredly said, "Put it somewhere, later will do." "Where shall I put it, when no one will accept it?" "Then leave it, please," Bindu said, moving elsewhere. Her aunt came and said, "Yes, Bindu, how much dough will you need this time? Just show me once." With a heavy face, Bindu replied, "How much to need? How would I know? You all are the mistresses of the house, don't you know?" Her aunt, astonished, said, "Listen. So many people will eat at this time, how would I know?" Angrily, Bindu said, "Then tell him. He was my sister. During Amulya's ancestral ceremony, everyone in the city feasted for 3 days, and she never once said, 'Little bride, do this, see that.' The worth of his bone is more than everyone in this house." Saying this, she walked into another room. Kadam came and asked, "Sister, my brother-in-law is saying about the worship clothes?" Before he could finish, Bindu shouted, "Go eat. You all eat. Get out of my sight." Kadam hurriedly fled. After a while, Madhav came, calling several times, "Hey, can you hear?" Bindu moved closer, shaking, and said, "I can't. I can't. I can't do it." "Is that enough?" Madhav looked at her in surprise. Bindu said, "What will you do? Will you hang me? If so, do it," and she quickly left, crying. Time passed. Bindu, restless and without any work, began to wander from room to room, blaming everyone. Someone had hurriedly placed some utensils on the path. Bindu angrily threw them into the courtyard, teaching them how to work. If anyone's wet clothes brushed against her, she tore them apart, showing them how to dry clothes. Anyone who came before her made a hasty retreat. The poor priest came in and said, "It's getting late, there is no sign of any arrangements." From a distance, Bindu sharply replied, "In a busy household, time will always be there." Saying this, she kicked another utensil and sat lifelessly on the floor of another room. About 10 minutes later, as soon as she heard a familiar voice, she jumped up and went to the door to see Annapurna standing in the courtyard. Overwhelmed with grief and anger, Bindu burst into tears. Wiping her eyes, she came forward with her shawl in hand, joining her hands and said, "It's 10 or 11 o'clock, how much more hostility will you show, sister? If I take poison, it will fulfill your desires, won't it? Then send me a bowl when you go home." Saying this, she threw the bunch of keys at her feet and rushed to her room, collapsing on the ground and crying. Annapurna silently picked up the keys, opened the door, and entered the pantry. In the afternoon, the influx of people, serving and eating began to lessen, yet Bindu continued to feel restless, bustling around the house. Bhairav came and said, Amulya is not at school. Bindu shot him a fiery glance and said, poor fellow. Do children stay at school until night? Are you new here? Could you not see if he was at that house? Bhairav said, he is not there either. Bindu yelled, where is he? Playing with some lowly boys? Does he fear for his life? If one eye gets blind now, the elder mistress's desires will be fulfilled. Then he will eat with 10 hands. Bring me whatever you find. Annapurna was sitting by the pantry door, conversing with 5 other elderly women. She heard the sharp voice of the little bride. An hour later, Bhairav returned and informed her that Amulya was in the house but had not come out. Bindu couldn't believe it. He hasn't come. I called him. Bhairav shook his head and said, yes, but he hasn't come. Bindu paused for a moment and then said, what is his fault? As the mother, so the son. I will not give a curse to a mother like that. What shall I do, if I see her face? Later that night, as Annapurna prepared to leave, Madhav personally came to escort her. Bindu rushed over, angrily pointing at her husband, you are taking her home, but do you know he hasn't touched the water? Madhav said, that's for you to know, not for me. I saw everything spoil, and I went to call him, now I'm taking him back myself. Bindu replied, very well then. I'll see you going that way. Without answering, Madhav said, come, sister, don't delay any longer. Let's go, priest, Annapurna said, but as she stepped forward, Bindu roared, people say mother-in-law is an enemy. What came to your lips? You dressed it up with 10 lies, keeping him from seeing his son for 4 days and nights. God will judge this. Saying this, she hid her face in her shawl and stifled her sobs, falling into the kitchen veranda, fainting. A commotion arose, Madhav and Annapurna both heard it. Annapurna turned around and said, what happened? Madhav said, no need to see, let's go. The quarrel that had been concealed for days was no longer hidden. The next day, when the women of the house gathered in one place, Ilakshi exclaimed, there's been a quarrel between the daughter-in-law and the daughter. What's happened to the boy, that he couldn't come even once? The little bride has not told a single lie, like mother, like son. I've seen many sons, but I've never seen such a disloyal one. With tired eyes, Bindu glanced at her and lowered her gaze in shame and disgust. Ilakshi continued, you love your son, little bride, take my Narendranath, he's yours now. Kill him, cut him up, he's not even worthy of saying a word. Such children are never good. Saying this, she laughed heartily. Bindu felt enraged. Don't speak nonsense. Your child might be God's miracle, or might end up eating in this way. Who has God even sent? Why, has God sent anyone? Bindu retorted sharply. Annapurna stepped forward and said, what's wrong? Everyone can say anything, why shouldn't I speak my truth? You're right. The day we forget our pains, you will be the first to cry foul. Oh, so that's how it is? You think you're the only one who has suffered? Annapurna said. Go now, I am bound to do what the Lord says, Bindu exclaimed. Loyalty, I see. Since you and your husband have come, there has been no loyalty to anyone here, said Annapurna. Even if I die, I'll have to take my husband back. And all the love you claimed in your time? Are they all true? You're not even a daughter. You're merely a puppet. Anyone can take care of you. The path to school goes in front of the house. For the first few days, Bindu had taken this path while hiding her precious umbrella, but for the last 2 days, that red umbrella didn't pass along the way anymore. As she watched, tears welled up in her eyes, yet she sat behind the eaves of the house, gazing intently down the path. In the morning, around 9 or 10, many boys walked by with different umbrellas. After school, many boys returned along the same path, but Bindu saw none of those figures or umbrellas. That evening, wiping her eyes, she came down and called Narayan aside to ask, "Yes, Narayan, this is indeed the direct path to school, so why doesn't he come this way anymore?" Narayan remained silent. Bindu continued, "It's fine, you two brothers can go back and forth while chatting, that's good." Narayan had loved Amulya in his own way and whispered, "He's too shy to come this way anymore, he goes around the other way." Bindu smiled through her pain and said, "What's there to be shy about? No, you tell him to come this way." Narayan shook his head, "He'll never come this way, mommy." "Why do you think he won't?" Bindu, eager, asked, "Why not?" Narayan said, "You won't get angry, will you?" "No." "You won't tell anyone at home?" "No." "He won't tell my mother either?" Bindu, anxious, replied, "No, no, you tell him I won't tell anyone anything." Narayan whispered, "The third master had given Amulya a good earful." In a moment, Bindu flared up, "Why did he? Haven't I told you not to raise your hand against him?" Narayan waved his hands and said, "What's his fault, mommy? He's a newcomer. Our servant, that scoundrel Hebo, has told my mother. My mother isn't any less of a scoundrel, mommy, she's told the master, and the third master has promptly scolded him." "Wait a minute, what did Hebo say?" Bindu interrupted, quickly stopping him. Narayan replied, "What do I know, mommy? During tiffin, he takes my food, he rushes back and says, 'What food is there, Narayan bhai?' Mother hears and says, 'Amulya is watching. Doesn't anyone take food for Amulya?' Narayan touched his forehead, 'Where will they get it, mommy? They're poor folks.' He takes 2 roasted chickpeas in his pocket and sits under the tree over there during tiffin." The entire household seemed to sway above Bindu's eyes. She sat there reading and said, "Narayan, you go." That night, after much calling, Bindu could hardly lift her hands to eat and eventually rose, claiming she felt ill. The next day, she remained almost fasting and could not speak to anyone, finding no way out. She only grew fearful, worrying that if she spoke, her own guilt would multiply. In the afternoon, at the time for her husband's meal, she sat close as usual but looked away. She couldn't bring herself to glance at any food item since yesterday. The room was lit, and Madhav was quietly reading with his eyes closed when Bindu came and sat at his feet. Madhav looked at her and asked, "What?" Bindu, with her head lowered, touched a toenail of her husband's foot. Madhav, sensing his wife's inner thoughts, said tenderly, "I understand everything, Bindu, but what good will crying do in front of me? Go to him." Bindu was truly crying and said, "You go." "If I go, will your brother not hear my words?" Bindu replied without answering, "I'm telling you, I'm at fault, I'm the one who crossed the line, you tell them." "I cannot," said Madhav, turning away to lie down. Bindu sat waiting for a while, hoping, but when Madhav did not speak again, she slowly rose. Her husband's indifference felt like a stone-cold scorn, spreading across her heart like a vast mountain in an instant. Today she realized without a doubt that everyone had abandoned her. The next morning, Yadav sent a letter granting permission for the younger bride to leave. Bindu's father was ill and urged her to travel immediately. With tearful eyes, Bindu got into the carriage. Brahman Thakurani came near the carriage and said, "Take care of your father, and return quickly, dear." As Bindu got down to take his blessing, he seemed quite uncomfortable. No one had ever seen Bindu so humble, so submissive. Taking the dust from his feet on her head, Bindu said, "No, dear, whatever happens, you are a Brahmin's daughter, older in age, bless me so that I may not return, let this be my last journey." The Brahmin girl could hardly say anything in response. Looking at Bindu's weary, exhausted face, she burst into tears. Ilakshi was present and chimed in, "What's this, younger bride? Doesn't anyone else's parents fall ill?" Bindu didn't respond, turning her face to wipe her eyes. After a while, she said, "I also pay my respects to you, Thakurji. I shall leave now." Thakurji replied, "Go, sister, go. I'll stay here and will see and hear everything." Bindu didn't say another word as the coachman drove off. Hearing this from Brahman Thakurani, Annapurna remained silent. Until now, Bindu had never gone to her father's house without Amulya. Today it had been over a month since she had seen him even once. Annapurna understood her sorrow. That night, Amulya was lying down beside his father, talking softly. Downstairs, in the light of the lamp, Annapurna was sewing a quilt when suddenly she let out a long sigh and said, 60. 60. Did she say that this would be her last journey? May Mother Durga protect my child and let him return safely. Upon hearing this, Yadav sat up and said, "You've never done this right, elder bride. Did none of you recognize my mother?" Annapurna replied, "She never once called me sister. She could have forcibly taken her child, but she didn't. That day, after working all day, I returned home only to be met with a torrent of harsh words." Yadav said, "I alone know my mother's heart. But elder bride, if you can't forgive this, what's the use of your growing up? You, too, just like Madhav, must have somehow contributed to my mother's misery." Tears began to stream down Annapurna's face. Amulya asked, "Father, why has the younger aunt not come?" Annapurna wiped her eyes and said, "Will you go to your younger aunt?" Amulya shook his head, "No." "Why not?" "The younger aunt has gone to your grandfather's house, you should also go tomorrow." Amulya remained silent. Yadav asked, "Will you go, Amulya?" Amulya hid his face in the pillow and shook his head. The following nights, Yadav was getting ready to leave for work. On the 5th or 6th day, on such a final night, he was prepared and distractedly smoking his pipe. Annapurna said, "It's getting late." Yadav, in a hurry, put away the pipe and stood up. "Today I feel very bad, elder bride. Last night my mother seemed to have stood behind that door." "Durga! Durga!" he cried and went outside. The next morning, Annapurna was wearily working in the kitchen when a servant from that house came with news that the Babu had gone to Farishdanga the previous night. His mother was said to be seriously ill. Remembering her husband's words, Annapurna's heart sank. "What illness?" The servant replied, "I don't know, ma'am. I heard that she has fallen unconscious and is suffering from a severe illness." After returning home in the evening, Yadav, upon hearing the news, began to cry. "After so much effort, I brought the golden idol home, elder bride, and now you've let it float away. I'm going right now." In grief and self-reproach, Annapurna's heart was breaking. She loved the younger bride even more than Amulya, perhaps. Wiping her own eyes, she insisted on washing her husband's feet and, forcing him to sit down for dinner, went out to the dark veranda. After a while, they heard Madhav's voice from outside. Annapurna held her heart in her hands, plugging her ears tightly and sitting still. Seeing the darkness in the kitchen, Madhav returned and saw Annapurna in the dark and dryly said, "Boudhan, I suppose you've heard." Annapurna couldn't lift her face. Madhav continued, "Amulya needs to go, I believe the final time has come." Annapurna collapsed to the ground, gasping. Yadav, rushing from the room like a madman, cried, "This can't be happening, Madhav. I tell you, it can't. I haven't knowingly or unknowingly caused anyone sorrow, God would never punish me with such a fate at this age." Madhav stepped back, raising his hands to bless him, and asked, "Will you go?" "No. It can't happen, Madhav, it can't," Yadav declared. "I can't bear this pain, it's so heavy." Annapurna spoke up. "Yadav, go, go, don't let your heart be restless." Yadav glanced at Annapurna, who stood trembling. Madhav softly added, "Let's wait a little while, perhaps she'll come back." "How long, Madhav?" Annapurna sighed deeply. "Wait, let's wait," Madhav reiterated softly. Annapurna felt as though her heart was about to explode. Looking down, she said, "I'll leave now." Yadav replied, "You leave." She left, promising to return, but soon came back. Amulya was also waiting there, and hearing Madhav talk softly, she interrupted, "You know, I want to hear from the younger bride today, at any cost." Madhav, looking at Yadav, pressed, "You should go and meet her." Yadav shook his head. Annapurna decided, "Come, let's go." But they couldn't go. They waited there and waited until late in the night. Annapurna listened carefully, even if the night was still, they could not hear anything. Suddenly, Amulya looked to the corner and said, "What happened?" "What?" Annapurna replied. "Does Amulya really not come at night?" Amulya said suddenly. Madhav replied softly, "You don't have to worry about her, son, she'll come. Tell her not to be angry with me." Annapurna replied, "No one is angry, just sit still, she will come." Suddenly, Amulya shouted, "Then let's go." Yadav laughed heartily, holding out his hand, "You think so? Is it all real?" Amulya asked excitedly. "Yes. Real." Yadav confirmed. "Where is she?" Amulya asked. "She'll come. Then she'll return." Amulya exclaimed. "Of course she will," Annapurna added. Just as Amulya was feeling happy and preparing to leave, suddenly, as though the world had spun upside down, the light went out in front of the house. A heavy wind blew through, as if a new life had been given. Yadav realized it was time for them to leave, so he rose and got dressed hurriedly. "Hold on!" Madhav called. Yadav, as if startled, turned around to see what was happening. He stepped back and yelled, "What have you done?" Just then, they heard a loud thud, like a clap of thunder. They couldn't understand it at first. Then slowly, the darkness enveloped them. The sound reverberated like a long echo in the air. Yadav felt a chill running down his spine. "What do you think has happened?" he wondered aloud. "I don't know," Madhav said. Annapurna, terrified, exclaimed, "You don't know? What will you do? This is your doing. Don't be frightened, elder bride," Madhav urged. Yadav turned, a little frightened, and said, "No, I don't believe it." "Your belief won't change anything," Annapurna argued. Suddenly, a faint light glimmered in the distance. It felt like the dawn breaking after a storm. Yadav sighed, "What have we done?" "Never mind," Madhav replied.